The objective of this rebuttal to Dr. Carrier is to ascertain the following. Would the rulers of the Roman Empire have taken a vested interest in falsifying the resurrection of Jesus? If so, what set of circumstances would have necessitated the Romans to take such action? In response to this area of discussion, Dr. Carrier has advanced a position which asserts that no known effort was made, inferring a lack of interest on the part of the empire to falsify. Yet, an official tome of the empire ascribed to Pilate was published and diligently spread abroad under Maximin II, signifying the empire's aspiration to address such claims. While Dr. Carrier seems to concede this act of the empire in the 4th century, he believes this was an isolated event that was only precipitated by Christianity's rise in popularity, resulting in a political problem for the Romans. Dr. Carrier's logic would have us believe that such burdens were not felt by early administrations of the empire from the Christians, hindering its desire to falsify claims against them. Significant evidence that counters Dr. Carrier's belief can be found throughout the serious tone of Pliny's communications with Emperor Trajan. Christians in Pliny's province had rendered themselves repugnant to the ancient and settled laws of the Roman state by assembling themselves without authority, a disruption in the state of affairs within Bithynia that caused the governor great concern. Hence Pliny's edict outlawing Christians assembling. According to Livy, foreign religious ceremonies against the state religion of Rome were deemed unlawful. Christians meeting secretly in their homes to worship their god, as opposed to publicly worshipping at temples in Bithynia, would be perceived as a threat to the state. This is a parallel Dr. Carrier clearly recognized in the case of Baculi. Pliny regarded the rising popularity of Christianity as a contagion that was infectiously spreading throughout his province. It impacted populations within cities, neighboring villages, and the countryside, which would constitute a pressing political problem that was worthy of being addressed. The governor acquired knowledge through his investigation of Christians that revealed a debased superstition carried to great lengths, a natural inference to the resurrection of Jesus. Why wasn't a tome published under his command falsifying such a narrative? Was Pliny somehow inept in his duties as governor? Was he unable to possess the foresight to remedy the political problems Christians posed in his province that was clear in the mind of Maximin II? The actions taken by Pliny upon learning of this debased superstition carried to great lengths was not that of a disinterested party, despite what Dr. Carrier has suggested. The governor specifically stated, "I postponed my examination and immediately consulted you. The matter seems to me worthy of your consideration, especially as there are so many people involved in the danger." Nevertheless, no known tome was published by Pliny to falsify this so-called contagious superstition that was spreading throughout his province. While Dr. Carrier has suggested that documentation from the period in question may not have transferred down to Maximin's administration to assist in debunking Christian claims, surely this would not be the case for Pliny, given his relationship with the historian Tacitus and his uncle. This lack of a contradictory response is consistent with the affirmation that the empire was unable to falsify the resurrection of Jesus. The plight of the Christians in Rome was also perceived by the Emperor Nero as a political problem in his administration, circa 65 AD, which explains why Tacitus tells us that Nero falsely accused the Christians of setting fires in the marketplaces of Rome. Tacitus reports Christians were infamous for their abominations. This sheds light on the height and popularity of Christianity in Rome. Tacitus clearly assessed Christianity as a threat when he emphasized the Christians' destructive superstition, reporting that it had erupted again, not only through Judea, which was the origin of this evil, but also through the city of Rome. Given that Tacitus introduces this information with a strong allusion to Jesus, and the extreme penalty he suffered at the hands of Pilate, this destructive superstition, mentioned by him, all points back to the resurrection of Jesus. This places the resurrection on the empire's radar, and the urgent nature of Tacitus's language paints a vastly different picture than what Dr. Carrier asserts. Were records not available to Tacitus to falsify such a destructive superstition? Tacitus would have had access to reach out to Josephus, Agrippa II, or his court for information. Tacitus plainly describes the Christians with language that deems them a threat to Rome. He calls them infamous and depicts Christianity as a political problem for the Emperor Nero that is spreading its destructive superstition throughout Rome and Judea. Despite his serious tone, no tome was produced in Tacitus's histories or annals falsifying the Christians' claims. For Tacitus to publish such a tome without convincing evidence would be unwise and likely embarrass the emperor, costing him his head as a Roman citizen, which would explain his reluctance to do so. According to Suetonius, Christians also appeared to be a political problem earlier for the empire, at the time of Claudius. Suetonius' statement seems consistent with the arrival of Christianity in Rome, that caused constant disturbance amongst the Jews in the area over a certain Christus, leading to the Jews' expulsion from Rome. While Dr. Carrier may dispute this assessment, what other group could Dr. Carrier document associated with a certain Christus that could have caused notable social and political dissension throughout the Jewish community of Rome? The evidence would be consistent with the Christians, a class of men Suetonius identifies given over to a new and mischievous superstition, another statement congruous with the resurrection of Jesus. The writings of Pliny, Tacitus, and Suetonius in regard to Christianity echo one another in terms of their serious concern for the wave of political problems instigated by Christianity's rise in popularity for the empire. The indicated was perceived by the Roman officials as a very real danger to the state of affairs, which, according to Dr. Carrier's logic, should have warranted a response in the form of a falsification, as was in the case under Maximin II. Yet, no credible tome published to falsify Christianity's destructive superstition exists. Nevertheless, we do see the same procedural precedent employed in the case of the Baculi, now of Christianity, which explains why those seated at the court of the emperor, like Festus, Felix, Agrippa, and others, were interested in interviewing Paul, contrary to Dr. Carrier's assertion. Acts 25:19 reports that Festus and King Agrippa had knowledge of Paul's testimony, and were therefore aware of claims about Jesus' bodily resurrection prior to the hearing. While Dr. Carrier asserts that the resurrection of Jesus never comes up in that hearing, the record states otherwise. Paul testifies that he bore witness to those which the prophets and Moses did say should come, in that Christ should suffer and be the first that should rise from the dead. If Paul were only referring to a type of spiritual, metaphorical resurrection, then why would Festus respond in the manner he did? Festus's response is reminiscent to the response of the Athenian philosophers at Areopagus Hill, when they cast their judgment on Paul's preaching of Jesus and the resurrection. Festus charged Paul with lunacy for his beliefs, something he would not have done for believing in deities like Manus and Lares. This escalated charge points towards a logical conclusion. Festus and Agrippa were aware that Paul was preaching about a bodily resurrection. This connects with Paul's statement in verse 26 that such events could be falsified. Yet there is not a single record in existence from the governor or the king that falsifies Paul's claims. Dr. Carrier has certainly explored in his writings the proper set of circumstances that would have necessitated the Roman Empire to open investigation into the resurrection of Jesus to falsify the narrative. Dr. Carrier delves further into his idea when he explains, if the tomb was empty and Christ's followers were reporting that he had continued preaching to them and was still at large, Pilate would be compelled to assume an escape had occurred, and would have to haul every Christian in and interrogate every possible witness in a massive manhunt for what could only be to his mind an escaped convict, who was not only guilty of treason against Rome for claiming to be God and King, but now also guilty of escaping justice and continuing to lead a rebellion. Unquestionably, there is evidence available for us to scrutinize that indicate the Romans were privy to claims about Jesus' resurrection, and were moved to open an investigation in response. All four Gospel accounts report an empty tomb. Matthew's statement affirms that a polemic commonly reported against the Jews was that the disciples came by night and stole away the body. Strikingly, the Nazareth inscription provides positive empirical evidence that is consistent with either a direct response to the discovery of the empty tomb, or a later Roman response to the Christians' contagious superstition that Pliny, Tacitus, and Suetonius alluded to in their statements. The historical documentation is consistent with claims of an empty tomb, and there is no documentary evidence to the contrary. In addition, we are presented with testimony of two competent witnesses in Justin and Tertullian, who provide context to the existence of key Roman records, the Acts of Pilate. Both individuals advocated for the divinity of Jesus on account of his life, death, and resurrection, pointing to those Acts of Pilate they believed existed and would confirm those facts. The trial, sentence, and crucifixion of Jesus were official acts of Pilate in his administration of Roman authority, contrary to Dr. Carrier's suggestion. The law was imperative as to Pilate's prescribed duty to report, according to Cicero, especially charges on one who had disturbed the peace and was charged with treason against the throne. Also, reports concerning religious matters were to be made to the emperor by the governors. This was certainly the case in Pliny's letters to Trajan regarding the Christians in Bithynia. Tertullian refers twice to a report made by Pilate to Tiberius. Reportedly, Pilate informed the emperor that he deemed the death sentence an unjust fate for an innocent and divine person. The emperor was so moved by Pilate's recount of Christ's miracles and resurrection that he rallied for Christ to be ranked among the gods of Rome. However, the Senate refused. Eusebius, who was at the court of Constantine, corroborates that it was customary for provincial governors to report the current local situation to the imperial office. Dr. Carrier's perspective relies heavily on biblical scholar F. Bruce to counter Tertullian's testimony. However, his conjecture on what we know of Tiberius is refuted by Tacitus, who tell us Tiberius, while he tightened his control by his conferments on Drusus, allowed the Senate a shadow of its ancient power by inviting it to discuss provincial petitions. This is consistent with Tertullian's testimony. The rationale of Pilate petitioning Tiberius to go before the Senate to grant the Christians legal status would be to control and monitor the Christians in a public setting. Ultimately, the exploration and interpretation of facts presented here has established why the Roman Empire, with its able rulers, conversant historians, and executive control of the surrounding area, was unable to provide evidence that would effectively disprove the resurrection of Jesus. While Herodotus and Plutarch were able to provide a counter-narrative to the supernatural claims of Aristeas and Romulus, the Roman Empire, with all its power and resources, were unable to produce the same regarding the resurrection of Jesus, which would have been the obvious thing to do if it were a hoax. This would imply the possibility of the resurrection being the gospel truth.